Now that we've spoken about runtime complexity and we've seen a good example of it with the Fibonacci function, we're going to move on to the next big chunk of content in this course, which is data structures. Data structures are all about runtime complexity. And so all those discussions we had about identifying runtime complexity and all that kind of good stuff is now going to get super relevant in this next set of exercises. Now, when we start thinking about data structures in general, especially in the context of an interview, there's two big important things I want you to remember. So here's what they are. First, a data structure is some way of organizing information or data in your program with some optimal runtime complexity for adding, editing, or removing records. So in other words, these different data structures that we're going to look at all have very well optimized ways of accessing or editing data. And so in the context of an interview, usually a lot of these data structure questions are really themed around runtime complexity. If someone says to you, hey, write some function that does XYZ, one of the first things that I want to get you to think of is what data structure can I use to solve this problem that has some optimal runtime complexity for what we're trying to solve. And we're going to see many examples of this as soon as we start getting some background on these different data structures and seeing what each of them are good for. Now, the second thing I want you to understand, and this is something that's very confusing when you start working with some classic data structures in JavaScript. All right, so this is something that will be a little weird. JavaScript natively implements several very important, very core data structures. Even so, you're going to be asked about what I call here kind of inferior data structures. That's not the best term in the world. Let's look at a diagram that's going to help kind of illustrate what I mean by this. So here's a diagram, kind of like, I don't know, not quite a pie chart, but the big blue circle is kind of demonstrating what a JavaScript array has the capability to do. So a JavaScript array has the capability to do a tremendous number of different things. Now down here in this tiny little white circle, I'll make it like as small as I can possibly make it basically. This tiny little circle of functionality right here is what a queue does. And so what I mean by this diagram right here is to say a JavaScript array does everything that a classic queue data structure does. Nonetheless, you will still have interviewers who ask you to put together a queue from scratch. That's what I'm trying to get at here. So there are portions of JavaScript that take care of these really fancy data structures for you automatically. However, you will still have interviewers ask you to build these tiny little basic things from scratch. Now, in some cases, especially in the case of a queue or an array, we are going to use a JavaScript array to represent a queue. And that's the part that is kind of confusing when you start doing this interview stuff. You're thinking like, wait, why am I making a queue when I could just use an array? But wait, I'm going to make a queue out of an array? Like, that doesn't make any sense. So this is just one thing I want to kind of introduce you towards and get you thinking about as soon as we start working on queues and stacks in particular. Speaking of which, the very first data structure that we're going to look at in the next section is a queue. So let's take a quick break. We're going to continue in the next video and we're going to start to discuss exactly what a queue is and how it works.